Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end. I would also like to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Embroidered, painted, stamped, carved, and engraved coats of arms enjoyed continuous popularity in colonial and revolutionary America. As expressions of family identity, remembered or aspirational, heraldic arts are among the most compelling and enduring symbols of our interest in family roots. Today's webinar will survey the major genres of heraldic decoration from the 17th to the 19th centuries, considering how, why, when, and for whom they were made. And as an extra bonus, there will be an outline and bibliography of today's webinar that you can download after the presentation. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. Nathaniel Lane Taylor is the editor and publisher of The American Genealogist and a specialist in medieval Europe. He taught medieval and modern history at Harvard and elsewhere for 15 years, including the social, political, and military origins of heraldry at the time of the Crusades. A fellow of the American Society of Genealogists, Dr. Taylor is also a member of American Ancestors Committee on Heraldry and is the chairman of the Scientific Committee for the 36th Annual International Congress of Genealogical and Heraldic Sciences, which will be held for the very first time in its history in Boston in September of this year. Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Taylor.
Thank you, Curt, for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. This is a complement to some recent webinars on heraldry at American Ancestors, including two I gave last fall, an introduction to heraldry for genealogists, followed by an introduction to the Committee on Heraldry at American Ancestors. I am a genealogist and editor of the American Genealogist. I specialize in colonial and pre-colonial genealogy, but I also specialize in heraldry, and I've served as a volunteer on the Committee on Heraldry here at American Ancestors since 2006. As some of you know, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, now going by the name American Ancestors, is the oldest and largest nonprofit genealogical organization in the country. It was founded in 1845. Within it, the Committee on Heraldry was established in 1864, and that date makes us the oldest non-governmental organization in the world concerned with the study of heraldry. The committee has our own page within the American Ancestors website. This is a screenshot showing that you can reach it from the menu Signature Projects at the upper right. And that page describes the committee and introduces many of our projects. Now, many of our projects, including the Roll of Arms, are focused on a genealogical approach to heraldry, including gauging entitlement to arms based on proved descent from the bearers of those arms back in their mother countries. My previous heraldry talks have showcased the genealogical approach. In contrast, and I hope some of you might be relieved to hear this, today's talk allows me to wear the hat of a cultural historian, considering heraldry itself, heraldic artifacts, without focusing on the genealogy of those who used arms. And so if you're interested in more of that view, I urge you to check out some of my prior offerings in this webinar series. I always begin heraldry talks by defining heraldry, but not always the same way. Heraldry can be defined either as a convention of graphic design, often called a coat of arms, and a crest is part of a coat of arms, and everything related to those designs. Or a broader definition is heraldry is anything having to do with heralds. They were medieval professionals who became the first genealogists in pre-modern Europe. But finally, looking at heraldic art and artifacts, we can define heraldry and coats of arms more simply as a system of emblems of personal or family identity applied in various contexts. And that's really what we're looking at today. I also like to begin looking back in time at colonial and revolutionary heraldry by at first going only halfway back to the 1860s. Longfellow, the poet, helped to craft our national historic mythology. In 1863, in the dark years of the Civil War, he wrote Tales of a Wayside Inn, a collection of poems that includes the famous Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. The premise of the collection is that they are all stories told by travelers gathered at an inn. It's actually a real inn, the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, that's still going strong, 150 years after Longfellow and at least 200 after it was founded. In this inn, we focus at first on the innkeeper, a prosperous squire by the name of Howe, who presides over it. Longfellow said, "Proud was he of his name and race, of old Sir William and Sir Hugh, and in the parlor full in view his coat of arms, well framed and glazed, upon the wall in colors blazed. He beareth gules upon his shield, a chevron argent in the field, with 3 wolf's heads, and for the crest a wyvern, part per pale addressed. Upon a helmet barred below the scroll reads, by the name of Howe." Longfellow both admires and mocks the innkeeper, Mr. Howe, and his coat of arms hanging in the parlor below the sword his grandsire bore at the Battle of Concord during the Revolution. This is the frontispiece to the book, to the first edition, and you can actually see the sword and the coat of arms in the frontispiece in this sort of chiaroscuro, and the travelers, the tale tellers are in the foreground. Astonishingly, the Howe coat of arms from the Wayside Inn still survives. It is a real item. Longfellow must have studied it carefully. It's both typical of a mass market in these armorial paintings from the 1760s to the 1820s, and it's also unusual, not just because Longfellow made it famous. It was painted in watercolors by a known painter, a Boston painter named Christian Remick, about 1775. It features the painted coat of arms in the middle, which I've studied, and it's fictitious coat of arms. It's made combining elements of the coat of arms of 2 other families, and the words "by the name of Howe" in the middle, and then the blazon, the description of the coat of arms at the bottom. These are all typical of this whole genre of art. Also, something atypical at the top is a lengthy blurb mentioning famous Howes of yore in England, including the Sir William and Sir Hugh that Longfellow mentioned. The interesting thing is those people never existed. It's also interesting that more than one early copy of this Howe coat of arms survives, nearly identical, but done by different artists. This survival of multiples is unusual, and it may not be related to the fact that Longfellow made the Howes famous in the 1860s, because most of these copies predate the poem. So this piece is representative of a whole mass market of these painted coats of arms, and I want to dip into those a little bit before studying the other parallel examples of the genre. Here's a more typical version, the next slide. This is a gouache by Boston painter John Coles Sr., probably from about the time of the Revolution. A big difference with the Howe arms is that this one, for Phipps, does not have any long, fictitious textual blurb about ancestors above the whole artistic design. This is a simpler mass market product. It was obviously easier to do just this without manufacturing a text about fake ancestors. Now, the next comparison with the Howe coat of arms is something I hadn't known about until I just saw this image posted on Facebook a couple of months ago. It was designed by the exact same artist, Christian Remick, as the Howe coat of arms, and it also has a fictitious blurb at the top about a fictitious noble family supposed to be related to whoever this was painted for. In this case, the family name is Bailey, not Howe, and the arms are also a concoction of arms of other families. And it's interesting to me because I had not known that Remick had made more than one of these for different families. But to go back to the main genre of this artwork, this is the more typical example. This is the Phipps coat, one of the Coleses. These were made in relative abundance in Boston, as far as we know, almost exclusively in Boston, again, from the 1770s forward to the 1820s. American Ancestors CEO Emeritus Brenton Simons has personally been collecting these for some time. And a few years ago, he gave a set of these to American Ancestors, which form essentially a study group. They've been conserved and displayed together. And some examples of this whole genre of artwork will be on display when the headquarters reopens, well, during the Congress, shortly after the headquarters reopens in September. Here's a later version from the same studio, a different family, the family of Ward. After American independence, a taste for heraldic items did not dry up, contrary to what some of you might expect or believe. So one feature of these paintings did change. That's the placement of the crest at the top, or the replacement of traditional heraldic crests with the American flag. Now, this was probably not done for all examples that were made after American independence, but it turns out to be a relatively common substitution, probably in cases where a surname or a family was receiving a coat of arms, but there wasn't any information in the sources used for what the crest might be, the sort of separate design element that goes at the top there. But obviously, the evolution of the American flag, the number of stripes, the number of stars, is very useful. It's kind of like radiocarbon dating. It tells us, oh, well, this must be from about 1818 or 1820, depending on the number of stars on the crest. Now, after about 1820, it seems that these things were not made so much. And we'll come again to the trajectory of a decline in interest in heraldic items that was really remarkably late, just the 1820s or after. And then it goes into a slump for rediscovery with a fierce interest in the 1860s and later. And that's what Longfellow represents. So I've started right in with this particular subgenre, the gouache and watercolor coats of arms on rectangular, usually not very good paper. These are usually about 14 inches high. These enjoyed a vogue from the 1760s or 70s to about 1820. But thinking more broadly about the whole category field of heraldic artifacts, it's important to think historically at the big picture. Where do they come from, and how do they evolve? Heraldic display begins not with the things you decorate in your home, but it begins all the way back in the Middle Ages as working legal tokens of personal identity. And that includes shields borne by combatants in tournaments, the original sort of the use of heraldry and its reason for creation. But more practically, and in terms of the number of what survives, the first legal use of heraldry is on seals used on documents to authenticate the identity of their creator. And just the next two categories, back on the outline slide, are funeral monuments for commemoration, essentially permanently, of a heraldic identity. And finally, heraldic manuscripts, which we'll get to in a minute. But to go back to the seal image, so armorial seals are the earliest and most fundamental legal use of seals, dating back to the 12th century. They're highly portable, easy to carry everywhere they might be needed. And when silversmiths and engravers were established in the colonies, they were easy to make here from the 17th century onward. The use of armorial seals carries right over into the early national period, and there's no good statistical study, and genealogists, I would love to have somebody do this. There's no good statistical study showing the decline in the use of heraldic seals in documents in American archives. Armorial seals, I should say, were always used together with seals that didn't have heraldic designs continuously from medieval to modern times. So another thing that can be measured is the proportion of seals that are heraldic versus seals that aren't heraldic. And as I've said, they're still all around us in document collections. With documents that have been microfilmed and scanned online, usually if there's a seal present on a document, the seal image is impossible to make out. You have to use good overhead photography with the right kind of light. And so the example you have in the slide, it's actually one of the rare surviving, sealing matrices, a seal of a Dutch New Netherland colonist with the Beekman coat of arms. And then at the lower right, that's the seal of a New England colonist, John Jefford, an iron founder of Lynn. Jefford was a notoriously litigious person, and he left his seal in a bunch of documents. That's a photograph I took with a digital camera about 20 years ago at what is now Peabody Essex Museum. Now, gravestones. It's the other end of the spectrum, not as portable as seals, obviously. Laurel Gabel wrote an excellent article on heraldic gravestones in colonial America, focusing on New England. This was published by American Ancestors in the 1990s, unfortunately not online. But it's the South which claims the earliest dated armorial gravestone, and it was recently conserved at Jamestown. This is what we see here. The gravestone attributed to Sir George Yeardley is typical of late medieval, Tudor, early Stuart English funeral monuments. A big flat slab. This was imported stone. I don't know whether it's Purbeck marble, something dark, or something else. Actually, I should dip into the technical literature on this. And obviously with brass inlays that are now missing. The whole border, which would have included an inscription, the silhouette of the knight, and then you can see above the knight's shoulder in the far corner, with the sunlight shining on it, the outline of the shield that would have had his coat of arms in the top right corner. The other heraldic import category from the early colonial period that has greatly interested me, again, much more portable than gravestones. These are paper and parchment attestations of a heraldic identity. Now, the official end of the spectrum of what you can have that shows your heraldry on paper or parchment, or in the British context, are documents from the heralds that either grant arms or confirm them to you. The one illustrated here was brought to Connecticut by an immigrant by the name of Mansfield. It was a patent of arms from one of the English kings of arms to his grandfather, Lancelot Mansfield, in the 1560s. He brought it over. There are relatively very few of these that survive that have been identified, either in private hands or mostly now in public collections. But people did this. The gentry and others who were accustomed to carefully keeping these emblems of their status. Many of them simply brought this stuff with them to the colonies. This was done by leading families like the Winthrops, but also by ordinary families like the Phippins. My ancestor David Phippin was a master carpenter in Boston, and elaborate heraldic pedigree was sent by his uncle, who was a priest in England, copied many times over. There's a copy now in the MFA. The Thorolds, down on their luck merchants, who brought one of these things over from their earlier days as gentry in Lincolnshire. And sometimes people who brought these things over were carrying frauds with them, whether or not they knew them. And this is true of both the Scott and the minor heraldic pedigrees in different New England collections. I'll just leave you with that teaser. That's a whole separate category of curiosity. Now, let's go back to gravestones. Stark contrast with the imported Virginia Jamestown gravestone is the oldest surviving New England stone here. This is the grave of Leonard Chester in Wethersfield from 1648. It's an authentic coat of arms, two griffins or dragons here, but rendered by a local amateur with no experience of heraldic carving. What's fascinating about this is that it embeds a kind of fundamental mistake. If you look at it visually, you see two of these dragons arranged one over the other on this shield, and there's a line drawn across the middle of the shield. The upper dragon actually doesn't belong on the shield at all. If you look at the curved lines under his feet, those actually are, when you think about it, those are representations of what's called the torse, the wreath of twisted fabric that usually separates the shield from the crest. And so the crest figure is usually sitting on top of the torse. The crest figure lies outside the shield entirely, goes above it. And so this carver didn't realize that. He was looking at an example which showed a shield and a crest above it, and he put both the shield and the crest within this larger shield. So again, it's embeds for us the story of a carver with skills over here that did not extend to heraldry, attempting to reproduce a heraldic original, but without the skill to do it. 65 years later, the next image in Connecticut, there were still no skilled heraldic carvers in Wethersfield. This is the 1713 stone of Gershom Bulkley. And here what's interesting is that one has a very rudimentary, cartoonish rendering of an actual shield, an actual coat of arms of the family. And this Bulkley was a member of the English gentry family, which was entitled to this by descent. There is no doubt. It's fully proved genealogically. And you can see from the little snippet of text at the bottom left of this photograph, this is a detail photograph that just had this, that this carver was very good at typography. He has had no idea what to do with the heraldry. And so this is a kind of an evolutionary moment in the gradual acculturation of New England artists to heraldry. And we see another 1713 example in the next slide from Ipswich, Massachusetts. And what I love about this is that it's actually a shield in the middle, although it looks, Asian or Muslim in its interesting shape, a sort of fan-shaped thing inside the diamond, where the heraldic emblem has been combined with all sorts of other abstract symbols, which were the much more common vocabulary of gravestone carvers in New England by the early 18th century. Now, these images that I'm showing you, these good black and white photos, are all from the Farber collection of gravestone photographs of over 9,000 early New England gravestones from the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, that have been put online. There's a link in the syllabus that I've given to Curt, and hopefully, if you're curious, you can follow it up. The next stone should be much more recognizably expert. By the 1740s, in all media, not just stone, people in New England were accustomed to producing heraldic carvings. And this is true, I should say, not just of New England, but for the South as well, the Chesapeake. And I realized that after I put the slideshow together, that what I'm doing today is almost entirely New England. There's very little from the Chesapeake, and that's a potential sequel there. So this stone is fascinating because, sorry, let's go back to Peter Faneuil. It was done by an expert carver in the English heraldic tradition, but the coat of arms is French. Faneuil was French. The use of symbols, the stars, the heart, the funny little circle quartered by a cross, would not have been familiar at all to the carver. There were very few non-British coats of arms carved in and around Boston in this time. Faneuil, of course, is and has been ever since famous for his status in the city, but it's an example of the familiarity of the carvers, but also applying it to a new subject. And there are other ways that the Faneuil coat of arms is interesting I won't get into now. But let's go back to that third fundamental category of heraldic artifact. And this is manuscripts where heraldry was tracked and learned and studied. Manuscripts and then books that disseminated heraldry as in a kind of reference context. Paradoxically, they're one of the ways that heraldry came to be regulated, as it was in Britain from about 1530 onward. In many other European countries, heraldry was never the subject of either successful efforts or unsuccessful efforts to regulate it at the government level. But in Britain, that became the norm and the expectation. But paradoxically, the evolution of manuscripts and books that allowed one to consult who had what coat of arms also, of course, facilitate the rise in appropriating a coat of arms belonging to somebody else. You could look it up in a book and copy it for yourself or for a client. And this is exactly what happened, both in Britain and also in the colonies. The manuscript we're looking at here, the Promptuarium, was begun in 1602 by one of the English heralds, completed probably in the 16 teens, and brought to Boston by a successor in office of that herald, William Crown, in the 1650s, and then left here. It stayed in Boston ever since, and it made its way into the hands of the Gore family of painters. That brings us to the next manuscript, the Gore Roll, which is really the best known heraldic item in the American Ancestors collection. It has been for over a century and a half. It's much smaller. It has only about 100 coats of arms attributed to people in Boston or elsewhere in the colonies. I think it has several people from the Caribbean in it as well. We know from newspaper advertisements, correspondence, and other sources that the Gores who made this manuscript and then drew from it were active in two generations from the 1720s forward, painting arms for New England clients, and specifically sometimes providing coats of arms to clients who came to them not knowing whether they had a coat of arms or what it would be. And there are a couple of specific sources that allow us insight into that painter-client relationship. And that gets us to that other concept of heraldic arts and regulation. And I think I already stated this, and I just wanted to restate it. Heraldic compendia really allow, they're both a product of a rise in a regulatory culture, and they also paradoxically allow people to get around it by finding coats of arms in books and using them. One thing to remember in the 13 colonies is that in addition to Britons here, there were plenty of neighbors and others here in the colonies who came from other countries where heraldry was not regulated at all. And that's particularly true of our Dutch colonial neighbors and ancestors in New Amsterdam and the New Netherlands, who had come from a tradition where anybody could just design their own coat of arms and start using them. And they were a little bit nonplussed with the English annexation when all of a sudden they were not supposed to be able to do that anymore. So we'll come back to that concept in a couple of places later on. I want to move out now from these quasi-official ways that heraldry was used by seals, funeral commemoration, and then in manuscripts and books keeping track of it, to seeing it in use. And I love to start with a building. This is Holden Chapel at Harvard College. It's one of the oldest surviving university buildings in the United States. There are a couple of others that are just about as old at Harvard, and then there are only a couple of others elsewhere in the 13 colonies. I believe also it's the oldest building with personal heraldry incorporated into its fabric. And that's what we're looking at here. This elaborate woodwork over the east doorway of Holden Chapel, which was built about 1742 with the proceeds of the bequest of a wealthy widow, Mary Holden, from London. And these are her arms, hers and her late husband's, over the door. And she executed her husband's will, distributing about 20,000 pounds, including for supporting education in the colonies. Neither she nor her late husband had ever set foot over here. And so it's an interesting, completely abstract, completely arm's length commemoration of a donor that has survived for all these centuries. Now, I spent many hours in this building because it's been recently used as a rehearsal space for student singing groups at Harvard. I think I went through that doorway hundreds of times. And this was before I developed an interest in heraldry, but I wonder whether by osmosis, going under that doorway might have affected, what I now am curious about. Another point of interest is that this very colorful rendition that we're looking at is actually a copy on the East End from about 1920 of the original woodwork, which is still on the west end of the building, but that's now crowded out by a very high wall, by other buildings, and so it's not very photogenic. We go to the next slide, which is an image from just a few years ago. This was engraved after a landscape engraved by Paul Revere in 1767, and it's showing some of the buildings that are still extant at Harvard. So this is within a few years of the Revolution. This is a close-up, and Holden Chapel there is on the left, and we're looking at the West End, and you can see he just sort of impressionistically rendered the scroll work around the original coat of arms. So the reason that I have this image is that the custom of having personal heraldry displayed on a building was actually closely connected to funeral culture and funeral practices in Britain and in the colonies. And it would have shown the viewer that this building was essentially a funeral bequest, a pious bequest, commemorating the person whose arms are there. This is very close analogy to the next image, which is also very famous. This is an engraving after a view of Boston Common by Christian Remick. He was the same guy who did the fictitious Howe coat of arms, dated 1768. Now, what's usually the focus of this famous image of Boston Common is the fact that British regulars are shown camped out on the common in the foreground of this detail. And this because they had come over in the year after the Townshend Acts, 1767, 1768. They were the first year into their stay here, making themselves particularly unwelcome and unpalatable leading up to the Boston Massacre, and then events beyond that, which I think we're about to start commemorating soon, coming up on the 250th. In the background, though, this is the grand house, rusticated stonework of John Hancock, one of the leading citizens of Boston. And what's interesting is that in the moment Remick portrayed it, he portrays it with hanging from the upper dormer window here, the center dormer window, a diagonal hatchment, a diagonal rendition of a coat of arms, displayed for a period of mourning outside the house of a deceased person whose arms those were. Now, they aren't specifically visible as the Hancock coat of arms. Remick painted the Hancock coat of arms in a different place on this image because he dedicated the image to the Hancocks, to John Hancock, but it's not quite visible in that way here. But the link between what we saw in Holden Chapel, a sort of permanent hatchment, and the temporary hatchment hanging outside the Hancock house is, I think, a vital one here. I'm going to switch now to a surviving authentic hatchment, and this is one of the very few that survived that was actually painted, manufactured in New England. American Ancestors has a very fine hatchment from a Gookin family that has been on display in the past. It's much clearer and brighter than this one, but it was taken from a church in Kent where it had been hanging for a couple hundred years. So I prefer this one from the collections of Historic New England. And this is very typical. It's about 3 feet high, which is perhaps a little bit smaller than the huge one depicted in that Remick view of Boston Common. And very typically, it's on a black background. It's diamond-shaped, and it is in a memorial of a member of the Ting family from the 1710s or the 1720s. Now, from those hatchments, which were designed and painted on panels essentially for temporary use, one sees a very clearly derived, more permanent domestic heraldic product. The diamond-shaped hatchments gave rise to these diamond-shaped embroideries, which would not be hung outside because these were embroideries. They were produced by girls in prosperous families under paid guidance, the expert guidance of a schoolmistress, and then also of an expert painter like the Gores, who would have supplied the pattern, and embroidered probably over a period of time as an educational and finishing experience for teenage girls. Betty Ring was the scholar who cataloged dozens of these from 18th century Boston and all around New England, gathering evidence, including letters by women who spoke about visiting the herald painter John Gore to have him tell them what their coat of arms should be. In one famous case, he gave her two coats of arms to choose from, and she wrote a letter to her father saying, well, which one? So which one is our coat of arms? Or perhaps reading between the lines, neither of these is our coat of arms. Which one would you like me to embroider? Now, one variant of the embroideries, which was even more time-consuming and ultimately over the centuries, perhaps less durable, so they're extremely rare. This is called quill work, and it's made from rolled paper, fabric, and wire. So the frame is, or the framed item is deeper. It's almost three-dimensional, and you're rendering all the shading and all the movement of the design and also the field around the design. You see the central shield is almost recessed because the quill work kind of protrudes from around it. Quill work was almost exclusive to the 1730s and 1740s. I think there are fewer than a dozen examples, both heraldic and non-heraldic, that survive, mostly in museum collections. This was given to American ancestors, I think, decades ago, and was beautifully restored about 20 years ago with the support of the scholar Betty Ring. And I think this has been on display now for about 15 years and will be on display again at the Congress in September. It's the Lemon Phillips filigree made by a girl named Mary Lemon. It's dated 1732, and it celebrates the marriage of her parents with two coats of arms, one for Lemon and one for Phillips. And the Phillips coat of arms is actually painted in Gore's roll, in Gore's pattern book. So we don't have concrete proof that young Mary Lemon actually, sort of got the design or the pattern from the Gores, but there's a direct link between the Gore roll and the Lemon Phillips filigree. Both of these are in the American Ancestors collection. The next slide is and this was, I think, done recently as a photograph within American Ancestors, and it just shows you the exuberant three-dimensionality and the laboriousness of the work. Most of these, when you look at them from a distance, most of the pigments have faded out. But again, this close-up really shows you a little bit of the exuberance of the color as well. So embroidered arms, another view into how they were made, was recently shown in a scholarly study of an example held at the Winterthur collection. Somebody noticed that there was a little bit of text peeking out from under some of the embroidery, some of the thread, the finishing thread work on top, which looked like a color direction. Oh, fill this in gold. And so they said, well, let's X-ray the whole thing. And the next slide shows a little bit of a detail. Sure enough, underneath the threads, you see both, and kind of they show up as chalkish white here, both the outlines done with a kind of chalk pencil on the black fabric background, and also the words that say what colors. And this is a close-up of just the helmet, which was done, it's almost done like paint the numbers, shell. It's almost the sort of the swirling effect of painting a shell. The different shades of blue and other colors that were used are really fantastic. So embroideries ruled the roost as domestic, at least in terms of what's come down to us, as domestic expressions of heraldic identity. for several decades, from the early 18th century through to the beginning of the 19th century. One thing that's interesting is that the diamond pattern goes away and the rectangular pattern becomes more common after the Revolution. So by the end of the century, the usual field has shifted from black to a kind of buff silk. And the pattern has shifted from diamond to rectangular. And the locus of production apparently also shifts away from Boston to other regional, provincial towns in New England, including a big center of production in the Connecticut Valley that's been studied. There's an excellent collection out of the Griswold Museum. And this one was recently bought at auction by Brenton Simons, our CEO emeritus, from the Pomeroy family in Connecticut. And it really shows that this was, I think, through the naivety of the figures, it shows that this was schoolgirl work. It was completely misidentified by the auction house. These things, when they come up, are still not well known. The auction house thought this was, I think, 19th century Scottish work, and it's probably circa 1810. The Connecticut Valley. It's very clear. And the Pomeroys were a Connecticut family in Brenton's family tree, which is why he went for it. And I'm glad, because this will be on display in September as well. The rectangular form of those late embroideries might have derived from another kind of, I think, originally temporary funeral achievement. The funeral escutcheons painted on either fabric or paper that could have been used in a funeral procession, because they could be, you could create multiples of them. This is how they're sometimes depicted in 16th and 17th century funeral procession artwork from Britain. Very, very rare. Very few of these survive. There was one here created for a member of the Hancocks of Boston in 1764. This was a Thomas Hancock, and it's, the identification is through the shield on the right, which was the wife, the widow in this case of Thomas, who died in 1764. This was auctioned in 2013, and I don't know where its whereabouts is, but there was a good image posted online at the time. But it reminded one of us on the committee of another, which we do have in American Ancestors collection, and this is the next image. Exactly the same size, this time painted on paper instead of on silk, and this was given by bequest from a descendant of the Stockman family of Newbury, which did use this coat of arms. And it was not known exactly when this was from, but it's very clearly from the same genre of a funeral escutcheon, perhaps made in quantity, to celebrate the passing of a member of the family in the middle of the 18th century. Again, these are exceedingly rare, and this one will be on display in September. But these rectangular forms, of course, put us in mind the most ubiquitous heraldic decoration of revolutionary times, which moved forward from that very, I think you'd call it conservative, older shield shape of the funeral escutcheons we just saw, to the Chippendale style that really had taken over by the mid-18th century. And these are the book plates. This one we're looking at, when Curt saw this yesterday, he said, oh, the slide's backwards. But this is actually a copper plate, one of the rare surviving originals. This one by Paul Revere. This is at the Museum of Fine Arts. A book plate engraved for Ep Sargent, a member of the Sargent family. And this is, these things are not very large. They're, 4 inches high, 2.5 wide. But these were ubiquitous. And there are some good. They were all printed 120 years ago, so they're available now online. Collections that are hand lists of Chippendale armorial book plates. And they really show the kind of depth of this as a trend, as a fashion in revolutionary America. It really reads like a who's who of the gentry of the revolutionary generation. What's marvelous about having Paul Revere's own work and a copper plate for this. Oh, and I should say that we are going to exhibit in September a copper plate, alas, not by Revere, but by Nathaniel Hurd, for another Boston gentleman, a copper plate from which a book plate was pulled in exactly the same period. Why I'm showing this Revere's book plate for the Sargent is that really the last category that I haven't talked about is armorial silver. And here is another Revere piece, also at the MFA. And this is, of course, hollowware. It's a gorgeous coffee pot. And the arms are the same. The client is the same. These would have been the same people. Revere, Hurd, Remick. Remick may not have been an engraver, but he was a painter. And so many of these people wore different hats, and they produced different items for the same clients. And this is the thing. So the skills used, I think the gravestone carvers would not have so easily changed media. And so their work is always, it always occupies a different kind of stylistic silo. But the hollowware, the book plates, and to some degree, these watercolor and gouache things, and also the embroideries. But more than any of the other products, the embroideries match the talents or the skills of a provider of the image, including the heraldic information they would have sold to clients, with the patient work of the family members of the clients themselves. This is obviously not the case with a coffee pot. The Sargents were not there putting the finishing touches on this. One thing also that's interesting about the armorial silver is that this silversmithing goes back into the 17th century, so more so than some of the other arts that we've seen, and particularly in New York, over Boston. The earliest armorial silverware or hollowware in the colonies are found for New York silversmiths working for New Netherland clients. So this is a baptismal or caudal cup for a member of the Van Cortlandt family. And again, going back to the question of the origin and the validity of the arms, the Van Cortlandts just made up their own coat of arms, and it's marvelous. There's a possibility that the windmill motif that they adopted really could have been just adopted in New Netherland and somehow emblematic of New Netherland itself and not just the old country. I think the same kind of possibilities can be explored for other Dutch families. I've really run out of time to go through different genres. But it's just to say that I'm going to leave off with hollowware because that's something that really could merit its own thing. And Curt and I have already talked about that. But I'm bringing this back with some closing concepts that I do want to keep in mind. Heraldic display in the colonies followed these traditional forms, including the most legally important forms, the kind of sealing and funeral commemoration. But then it branched out into new directions. And that's not to say that domestic heraldry didn't exist in the 15th and 16th century over in the old countries. And again, that's a whole other illustrated talk. But it certainly evolved in its own directions over here. That sense that we were a Wild West in the 13 colonies is important to keep in mind. But it's also important to remember that heraldic display continues without a break past American independence. The idea of independence did not turn Americans off the idea that their connections with their own ancestral families, as symbolized in the heraldry, or the idea of the desire to connect or to give the impression that you connect with elites, also did not expire. They were not seen as incompatible ideas with the revolution. But also remember the caveat that while the heraldry itself cannot specifically point to genealogical connections without a good deal of verifying in other sources, this heraldic display always tells us about family identity aspirations. How did people want to be perceived? And also, what did they think of themselves and their origins? So this was an example of some of the stuff you might see, but also some of the ideas that will really be on display in a way that's unusual for American conferences at the International Congress coming up in September. Curt already said this is the first time this biennial Congress that goes back in Europe to 1929 has been in the United States. It's been in Canada twice, once in the 90s and once in the aughts. There are going to be 3 days of scholarly talks and social events, as well as an exhibition featuring some of the things I've shown today, and plenty of other things. And that's just the next slide is really a teaser to underscore that I've only scratched the surface of the heraldic treasures that we have at American Ancestors and the way we've been studying them in context with other things in American and European collections. So I hope this has whetted your appetite. I don't know what specific questions you may have. I hope to see many of you in person in Boston in September. And now I'm going to close my mouth and allow Curt to give us some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nat. That was a splendid presentation. And my goodness, you're a good speaker. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. Shockingly, all 3 of these seem to involve me. We have on May 28th, the online version of an in-person event that I did earlier this month in Boston called, I'm misspeaking now. I'm just all over the place here. That's wrong. Just ignore everything I said. The Cock and Lion, French Design in British Historic Houses, I have never given before for any HGS, and that will be May 28th here in Boston. What I was talking about earlier was June 21st, from Plymouth to Penn, how the English country house inspired the writing of Jane Austen. That's the one that I gave earlier in this month here in Boston at the Chilton Club, and one of the lectures I think I'm most happy with that I've created. It was just so much fun to give. And I hope many of you will be able to join us online on the 21st of June. And then on July 9th, to coincide with the launch of our new book about the British Country House, there'll be a lecture entitled A British Country House Alphabet that I hope everyone will find fun and intriguing. You can register for all of these webinars at our website at americanancestors.org/events. You will also receive registration links in the follow-up email to today's presentation, and a reminder that that email will also contain a link to download Nat's wonderful 6-page outline and bibliography for today's webinar. So now let's go ahead and type your questions in the panel at the bottom right, and we will answer as many as we can. I'm going to start off with, I think, a very intriguing question, which is, do you have any thoughts about the relationship between the Washington family coat of arms and the design of the U.S. flag?
Well, my thoughts are inexpert thoughts. That's been carefully written about by others. There is an excellent article on the Washington coat of arms by my colleague on the committee, Joseph McMillan, and it's not at American Ancestors. It's on the website of the American Heraldry Society. And I think the bottom line is that no, there was not a conscious connection. And of course, now there is the flag of the city of Washington, D.C., which is based exactly on the Washington arms. But no, they were not originally. That's a kind of convergence idea. But that goes into the whole question. And I see there's another question that's really related about the heraldry of cities. And
yes, that's a perfect segue into that. I'm glad you brought that up.
And really, that's a whole other presentation. Joe McMillan is really much more expert on the development of civic heraldry in the United States. There again, it was bringing over norms and traditions of heraldry of dominion from British mother countries, but it was also an excellent example of American innovation, not just in the designs used, but in the whole concept of how they were used. And that's it's really only the question for a whole other presentation.
And I think the other great question here from Judith Allen, are surnames in the Gore roll searchable?
Yeah, so the Gore roll has been for some time. There are only 100 coats of arms in the Gore roll. It's small. It's been for some time available as a searchable database on American Ancestors, but it's also forthcoming as a book, a facsimile edition with a careful commentary that was actually first published in the 1930s by one of my predecessors on the Committee on Heraldry, Harold Bowditch, and is being reprinted with additions and corrections and with additional scholarly apparatus. including all the cross-references where coats of arms from the Promptuarium manuscript that was owned by the Gores were actually recycled into the Gore roll. But in its core database form on American ancestors, yeah, there's a straight up surname index, and that's an easy place to start.
So Laurel asked a very interesting question. Is it possible that early gravestone carvers were not working from an image, but from a verbal description of what was remembered or possibly expected?
That's a fascinating question. And of course, I should, without outing Laurel, I should say I'm very gratified that Mrs. Gabel was here for this presentation. I mentioned her, of course, and her work on armorial gravestones that was published in, I think, 1997. But also, the question is it possible from looking at some of the artwork, some of the surviving carvings, is it possible that they were done from textual descriptions? I think that's certainly the case with the Gershom Bulkley stone in Wethersfield. And of course, Mrs. Gabel is familiar with all of these. And I want to thank you publicly for it was many years ago now at a private visit at your home that you were very gracious to share the database that you had compiled while doing that chapter in Gravestone Chronicles 2. And I still make use of that. So that work, we haven't had a dedicated team committed to sort of updating that particular data set, but your notes are still something that I go back to often. And that's a question that one asks often when looking at heraldry with mistakes. What you ask is, why is that mistake made? And there are a couple of different cases where I've tried to think creatively about that, using the example of the Gershom Bulkley stone and others, where certainly one category of mistakes, it seems, is that people were working from textual descriptions.
Speaking to you from Boston, which we very modestly call the hub of the universe, I'm shocked to find Christine writing from either Virginia or Maryland, who's full of praise for what you've just done and wants to know if you'll be doing the same thing for Tidewater aristocrats.
Well, certainly with that kind of praise as well as a leading question or request, I would be amenable to doing it. Again, I would defer to my colleague, Joe McMillan, who lives in Alexandria, who has made it a personal project to visit all the armorial graves from the Chesapeake and has an excellent collection of photography and notes that in many cases were able to update the work of a couple of scholars of a century ago who were, carefully tabulated by Mrs. Gabel. But this is, again, a ripe field. And it's one of those fields where it's always fun to go back to that sort of rivalry question. Well, what was New England doing that the Chesapeake was not, and vice versa? Yeah.
Jamie asked a very interesting question, which is, were there any disputes between families for using the same designs?
Well, we don't have any case law because it was something that the colonial courts were not really set up to that. The archetypal case is Scrope versus Grosvenor, which is in the 1380s. And since then, it was not something that was really very commonly done, either in Britain or in the United States. There's some interesting case law from Scotland as well. So I don't think, and I should look carefully over some of the compendia of, curious cases from colonial New England. I don't think that ever rose to it. We don't see I think more than a hint of that in any correspondence either. Again, I think the Wild West mentality might have resulted in at least the person in the street taking a live and let live attitude. Although I would not be surprised to find that there was some indignation. There's certainly indignation in colonial diaries and letters about people who were doing other things to put on airs, to be more than they seemed, or to to embody a persona that doesn't match what they came from. And I wouldn't be surprised if heraldry is in there somewhere, but I haven't made a systematic search, and I'd love it if somebody found something that did that.
Well, Gary asked a question that I think many people would like to know about, which is, how would you go about searching or seeing if your colonial family had a coat of arms or had the right to carry arms?
Sure. Well, I would probably direct you in the first instance to one of my prior webinars here at American Ancestors that are recorded that really talks about genealogical approaches. And one of the questions is, well, how do you find out if your family has a coat of arms? Searching the indexes of the roll of arms of the Committee on Heraldry is a good start. Some of the bibliographies I've put together for other genealogically focused talks on heraldry give you links to a lot of the other reference sources where you can search. Although the caveat is that for most of these things that purport to be compilations of the coats of arms of Americans, there's no critical standard saying, oh, well, we know that this person was actually entitled by descent to, in most cases, we're talking about an English coat of arms or Scottish when that's on the table. So there are all the typical, the usual sources to consult. From one of my bibliographies, you've got clickable versions that you can do a lot of that work relatively quickly. But then it becomes a chicken and the egg question. What do you know about the genealogy of this particular colonial family? And if the origin is not resolved, you can never be certain that if you have evidence they bore a coat of arms, you can never be certain that it's with right in the British conception.
I'll bet you Ginevra can probably put a link in the follow-up email for today's presentation where people can watch that past video of yours. That would be great.
Sure.
And speaking of that, this is interesting. Did designs with those fake coats of arms persist in American products, such as ceramics and hollowware, in the 19th century, or were most registered or real heraldic designs?
Well, this is the thing. Certainly, by the 20th century, the concept of mass market producers of trinkets, baubles, jewelry, real jewelry made out of real semi-precious stuff in some instances, going all the way down to our equivalent of refrigerator magnets. This stuff begins with mass production and machine techniques relatively early on. I haven't done a study of 20th century newspaper advertising for this, but certainly our predecessors on the Committee on Heraldry, which goes continuously all the way back to 1864, they were squawking about this, relatively continuously from the Victorian era to today. I think there was a period in the early 19th century, from 1820 to the Civil War, that represents a trough, and there may have been a general lack of interest and commercial viability for kitsch heraldry, but certainly kitsch is an established part of the Victorian Industrial Revolution.
I think the last one I'm going to ask you officially is from Mary, who wants to know when coats of arms started appearing in transfer printed plates.
This is beyond my ken, and Curt, you and I were talking about this for the China trade and porcelain as well. So transferware and other media, which really represent newer generations of this stuff, I don't have good data on, and these are the areas in which I need to educate myself, and I'm looking forward to doing so, but I can't be any more help right now.
So what I would add to that is the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, has one of the most important collections of Asian export porcelain in the world. And they are an amazing resource for all kinds of heraldry on porcelain. And that's where I would start if you want to follow up on that question, Mary. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today. I want to thank our listeners. We had great questions. If you have other questions, you can contact us at any time at heritagetours@nehgs.org. Thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you soon on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.